Now, it's with great pleasure that I introduce our 2018 Wiles lecturer. Professor Alison Bashford is a historian of global science based at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia, where she is director of the New Earth Histories Research Programme. She was educated at the University of Sydney, where she was awarded the University Medal in 1990. Before taking up her current post, she was Vere Harmsworth Professor of Imperial History at Cambridge and a Fellow of Jesus College from 2013 to 17. And before that was the Whitlam and Fraser Professor at Harvard University in the Department of the History of Science. Her books have explored the complex relationships between world history, environmental history, and the history of science and medicine, with a recent focus on population. And her two most recent monographs are The New Worlds of Thomas Robert Malthus, co-authored with Joyce Chaplin and published by Princeton University Press in 2016, and Global Population, History, Geopolitics and Life on Earth, published by Columbia University Press in 2014. Earlier monographs addressed the subjects of imperial hygiene, a critical history of colonialism, nationalism and public health in 2004, and purity and pollution, gender, embodiment and Victorian medicine in 1998. Professor Bashford has a second interest in maritime history, serving as a trustee of the Royal Museums at Greenwich, and has recently co-edited Oceanic Histories with Cambridge in 2017, Quarantine, Local and Global Histories with Palgrave in 2016, and with David Armitage co-edited Pacific Histories, Ocean, Land and People with Palgrave in 2014. She co-edited the two-volume Cambridge History of Australia, which appeared in 2013, and with one of this year's Wiles Lectures academic guests, Professor Philippa Levine of the University of Texas, edited the Oxford Handbook of the History of Eugenics in 2010. She is a Fellow of the Australian Academy of the Humanities and was elected a Fellow of the British Academy in 2017. So I would now invite you to welcome Professor Alison Bashford as she delivers her first Wiles lectures on the subject of Trustees of Evolution, the Huxleys from Empire to World, 1825 to 1975, beginning this afternoon with Lecture 1 on Cosmos.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you for this great honour and invitation to the Wiles Trustees, to Queen's University, and a pleasure to talk earlier to members of the Boyd family. It's a great honour and pleasure to be here. I moved recently, as some of you may know, and as was just indicated by Professor Gray's very generous introduction, thank you. I moved from Cambridge back to Sydney, and part of the reason I did so was to chase the sun. But clearly I should have moved to Belfast instead. Really beautiful day here. Such a pleasure to be here. Can you hear me at the back perfectly well? Excellent. When Life magazine came for their photo shoot, 1947 this image is, Julian Huxley was very self-conscious in his arrangement of himself in front of a portrait of his grandfather there, Thomas Henry Huxley. So in the foreground we have a 20th century internationalist and a biologist, and in the background the portrait of a 19th century imperialist natural historian. Thomas Henry Huxley would have liked to have thought of himself as the imperialist natural historian of the 19th century. But in the foreground is the lesser-known Julian Huxley. He was author of The Science of Life, and here he was self-fashioning his curiosity and his cosmopolitanism for Life magazine. And he was displaying the expertise inherited from the library over his right shoulder and the scholarly bloodline from his grandfather over his left. And well might he do so, because between them, Thomas Henry Huxley and Julian Huxley, and here are their dates, drove forward and communicated the great modern story of the theory of evolution by natural selection. Thomas Henry was there at the original moment around the 1860s, And Julian Huxley pitched in very important ways in the 1940s when several generations of Darwinists were still trying to reconcile various difficult ideas. And Julian Huxley produced a very famous, very important book called Evolution, the Modern Synthesis. So together, these intriguing characters were trustees of evolution. And that's a phrase that Julian Huxley once used to describe all of humankind. And it's been very useful for me in this project, and I've borrowed it to describe the Huxleys themselves. Well, my lectures then over the next few days aim to track changing ideas, changing comprehensions of nature and culture in the modern world with and through Thomas Henry and his grandson Julian. I explore the great problems and really what they themselves would have called the great wonders of the modern world, wonders that they themselves raised and postured and pondered over this lifespan, 1825 to 1975. I'm starting to think of them, they were so similar, I'm starting to think of them as one very long-lived person. And that is because they both asked the same great questions. Questions about the changing nature of time, the connections and distinctions between human history and natural history, questions about the impact of minds on bodies and bodies on minds, about the deep past and the distant future of humankind, how to comprehend difference and unity between and among species, including Homo sapiens. They asked questions, both of them. Should humans actively seek to improve the future? What might humankind look like 10,000 years hence? How do humans fit into nature? That's the quintessential Huxley question that they both asked. So they both pondered the same momentous questions, but they did so in completely different contexts. The grandfather clearly in the high imperial 19th century, and the grandson in the international 20th century. So when I study them together over the next couple of lectures, when I do so, for me as a historian, they're quite useful because they offer a kind of an analytical time lapse, is how I'm starting to think of it, over the whole modern period, over the 19th and 20th century. Because they were so similar, and because the younger biologist here was constantly fashioning himself after his grandfather. So the span of these vital dates, 1825 to 1975, enables analysis of really complex and often quite elusive ideas about nature and culture and difference in a pre-Darwinian world, in a high Darwinian world, and in a post-Darwinian world. And in a world context for scientific thought that shifted from high imperialism to high internationalism. Well, I think by any measure, the Huxleys' significant questions and their problems that they both grappled with are surely still our own. But we consider them in a new age, what many people, and some geologists in particular, are calling the Anthropocene. That we do so is a matter that the Huxleys themselves, both of them, would have thrived on. They would have loved this current discussion about the new geological era that planet Earth now finds itself in, one in which some geologists are arguing is completely different to previous eras of Earth's history, because it has humans driving geological change. The Anthropocene as a proposed epoch and the science-humanities debate that has surrounded it really would have fascinated and entirely, thoroughly engaged both of these scholars. They were both scholars of geohistory. In so many ways, they were both there before us. The Huxley native habitat, intellectually speaking, was time, it was humans and the past, it was science in the public sphere, it was the meaning of civility and nature, and I should add, especially for the Wiles lectures, it was the history of civilization. So over 4 lectures then, we'll explore the Huxley versions of all of these ideas by scale. We will begin with this lecture with the cosmos, nothing less than, with the Huxleys as philosophers of the universe and on universal matters. And in lecture 2, I look at the idea of species, and in particular human-animal connections and disconnections in the Huxleys' thought. And I do so in the light of something that historians are increasingly in fact, many humanities scholars are increasingly engaged in, and that is, how do we think human-animal connections and disconnections? How do we think human-animal politics? And again, the Huxleys were definitely there before the current discussions. In lecture 3, I want to turn to their collective thought on humans of the past and humans of the future. And there we'll talk about the Huxley ideas on the history of civilization. And I examine then in the 3rd lecture their consideration of intra-sapiens distinctions, their very difficult thought on human equality and inequality. And then finally, on Saturday's lecture, I will examine the Huxley's interior worlds and the interior worlds that captivated the Huxleys in their extensive thought on human minds and indeed their thought on human souls. The way in which the entire family was deeply engaged with all kinds of concepts of consciousness and unconsciousness. So from the cosmos to inner selves, these trustees of evolution really carried the modern world with them. So I suddenly had a sense of T.H. Huxley, intimidating T.H. Huxley looking down on me and wondering whether I'm going to say the right thing. I mean, his portraits, and there are many of them, are they're often quite dark, actually, and he was certainly a very intimidating figure. But let me first set out the Huxley lives and thought. I know that many of you here are very close to the Huxleys and very learned about them. For those who aren't, I'm going to just spend some time elaborating their extraordinary lives and to begin to suggest what's yielded by considering them together. Thomas Henry Huxley here was and remains a very well-known zoologist, a natural historian, who so keenly defended Darwin from the earliest public dissemination and dispute over the theory of evolution by natural selection. So he was deeply learned in all manner of invertebrates and vertebrates as a natural historian, but actually he was trained in the human form, in the anatomy and physiology and pathology of humans. He was apprenticed as a medical doctor for most of his teens, and he became a surgeon with the Royal Navy in the late 1840s. And his first job, after his apprenticeship and after a degree that he took at the University of London, was on the HMS Rattlesnake as a very young man in the mid to late 1840s, a very long journey to Australia, as it happens, and to what is now Papua New Guinea. And he built on this interest to become one of the 19th century's great comparative anatomists, including of comparative anatomy of the human structure. I'm going to refer to him as T.H., Thomas Henry. T.H. is how his descendants now most frequently refer to him. And T.H. spent the majority of his working life as professor at the government and the Royal School of Mines in Kensington. So where the Science Museum and the Natural Museum both are now situated. He lectured there in natural history, and he pursued very well attended, very important lectures to working men. Apart from his very lengthy, challenging, but intellectually productive Rattlesnake voyage, HMS Rattlesnake voyage in the 1840s, and that was a voyage that was really foundational to his thought in the same way as the Beagle voyage was foundational to Darwin's. Apart from that, T.H. Huxley's was a London-centred professional life, an occasional appointment, lecturing trip to Edinburgh, a lecture tour in the US, continual public work with multiple royal commissions, the establishment of the museums and institutions for the teaching of science. He never stopped working. And working is the word, because quite unusually for his milieu, for his generation, T.H. Huxley worked as a salaried natural historian. And proudly so. Again and again, he draws attention to this. He elevated his family very significantly from quite modest and declining middle-class circumstances, elevating the family not to wealth so much as to comfort, security, and certainly to very considerable national and international recognition. Well, his son, Leonard, in the background here, was a Bloomsbury publisher and editor, and Julia Arnold of the literary family, Tom Arnold, Matthew Arnold, Leonard and Julia, I like to think, sexually selected one another, and in 1887, Julian Huxley was their firstborn. And Julian Huxley crossed years with his famous grandfather for 8 very important years. As Julian grew, he was a beneficiary of his grandfather's work in scientific and educational fields, and so he gained a much more conventional and full education. T.H. Huxley was very much an autodidact, despite his medical diploma and degree. Julian's educational life was much more conventional, if I can call it that. He was a student at Eton and then Balliol College, Oxford, surely not conventional, where he read zoology from 1906. And it's important, I think, to recognise that between T.H. Huxley's generation here and Julian Huxley's generation, the teaching of natural history had been transformed in both schools and universities into a recognisably modern curriculum of biology and zoology, in which Julian learned evolutionary theory as well as its critique amongst turn-of-the-century scientific discontents. And it's important to recognise that in Julian Huxley's turn-of-the-century generation of being taught, there were a lot of scientific, not necessarily, I mean, there were religious discontents to Darwin's theories, but there were a lot of scientific discontents. So in a way, Julian was in that quite privileged situation of learning the canon and the critique in the same moment. And it was, as I say, it was his work that went on to resolve some of that. Before World War I, he was in various positions in Naples, in Germany, a demonstrator back at Oxford, and then he accepted a position as a biologist at the new Rice University in Houston, Texas. And it's Rice University that is now custodian of boxes and boxes and boxes of extraordinary papers of Julian Huxley's personal papers. He was only there a few years. He quickly returned to Oxford, served in World War I, and then picked up a professorship in biology at King's College London. And over all of these years, Julian was an ornithologist primarily. Birds were his object of inquiry. And methodologically, as a scientist, he was an ethologist, someone interested in animal behaviour. So he was much more interested in animal behaviour than the anatomy that his grandfather had set down. To put that another way, he was far more an observer of animal culture than of animal structure. So he was quite successful as a young man, but despite that success, he traded it all in I think one of the really remarkable moves of academic history. He traded it all in his academic career in biology for one in science communication. He left King's College London in 1925 at the behest of the already famous and very larger-than-life H.G. Wells. And H.G. Wells said to him, "If you give up your job and join me in a cottage in Devon, we shall write a book called The Science of Life," which they did. And H.G. Wells said to him, I promise that you will earn £10,000 a year, which did not happen. But H.G. Wells, and I don't think anybody ever said no to H.G. Wells, H.G. Wells certainly said to him, "I will only offer this co-authorship if you abandon your job entirely." Julian Huxley did. And in a way, having looked very carefully through the draft chapters of that, Science of Life was in fact the world's first textbook in ecology, the new way of thinking about organisms in relation to one another. More on this in lectures tomorrow night. But I've looked in Rice University, Texas, that holds the Huxley papers, draft after draft of Julian Huxley's chapters for The Science of Life. And H.G. Wells, the great writer, was teaching Julian Huxley how to put a pithy sentence together. And there is red crayon slashes, vicious slashes, through page after page of Julian Huxley's chapters. But in so many ways, H.G. Wells was teaching Julian Huxley how to write as well as how to be a scientist. And Julian Huxley went on to become a wide-ranging communicator of the science of life in print and in radio and eventually in television. In so many ways, we should think of Julian Huxley as the antecedent to David Attenborough. Julian Huxley was controversial secretary of the London Zoo in the 1930s, Director General of UNESCO in the 1940s, co-founder of the World Wildlife Fund in the late 1950s. He was an A-list international speaker over the 1950s and 60s. Probably the only lectures he didn't do were the Wiles lectures. And over the 1960s, he travelled the world as really a kind of an A-list speaker on many of the controversial post-war questions. He followed through with his grandfather's agnosticism, the term that T.H. Huxley coined, and he followed through with his grandfather's humanism. He presented very detailed manifestos on what Julian Huxley called evolutionary humanism and on transhumanism, and that's the term we receive from Julian. Highly political, Julian Huxley was aligned with and participant in many of the high modern public statements that really challenged world scientists, world citizens, that term of his generation, and politicians. He was a signatory, for example, to the Geneticist Manifesto, 1939, more on that in tomorrow's lecture, I think, and the Humanist Manifesto, 1973. Well, behind the Huxleys lies, of course, Charles Darwin. He is underneath and around and behind the long Huxley story. And I have to say, as a historian of science, one of the challenges and intriguing possibilities here is to think about writing lectures and perhaps a book where Darwin is the shadow. But he's a fairly present shadow, it must be said. Tracking the Huxleys in some ways becomes another way of telling the long history of Darwinism over the 19th and 20th centuries. T.H. was inside Darwin's scholarly circle from the mid-1850s, before the publication of The Origin of Species, entirely aware of the theory under development. Not initially convinced, and indeed unpersuaded by natural selection, He nonetheless came out very much in Darwin's defence early and ultimately famously at the Oxford debate in 1860. Huxley and Darwin's interactions were close and ongoing as Darwin worked through the very notoriously difficult questions that his hypothesis raised, considering evidence from domesticated animals and plants, and ultimately, of course, Darwin offering his views on the descent of man in 1871. But it's important to recall that TH occupied that very difficult ground of how we think about evolution by natural selection with regard to humans. I mean, that's the most difficult thing. And TH occupied that area well before Darwin himself, at least publicly. So the middle essay here is by T.H. Huxley. It's from probably what remains his best-known work, the collection of essays, Evidence as to Man's Place in Nature, 1863, a study of the evolution of primates. Man like apes, ape like men. Well, Julian Huxley, on his graduation from Oxford, New College in fact, his grandson Julian Huxley spent July 1909 in Cambridge. That was the great celebration of the centenary of Darwin's birth and the 50th anniversary of the origin of species. It really was a very important moment in the history of Darwinism, as a generation of zoologists and biologists beyond Darwin's and his grandfather's, T.H. Huxley's own, had still not reconciled a great deal about natural selection. And as I say, it was Julian Huxley who was instrumental in its synthesis. Evolution, the Modern Synthesis, published in 1942, brought Darwinism and Mendelism together in the light of more recent genetics, especially population genetics. So Julian Huxley carried forward into the 20th century this very close association with Darwinism that his grandfather had thrived on in the 19th. These men of science, T.H. and Julian Huxley, were tied together, or more accurately, Julian actually and very actively grafted himself onto his grandfather's lineage. So a famous book, 1947, Evolution and Ethics, for example, was nominally co-authored by T.H. Huxley and Julian Huxley, even though the former had been dead for 52 years. But through Julian, the grandson, T.H. Huxley lived on. There was a kind of an immortality there. So the Huxleys' role in the history of evolutionary ideas has been very well analysed, not least by learned experts in this room, and very extensively so in the case of Thomas Henry, rather less so in the case of Julian. My lectures over the next few days don't work directly over that story, the Huxley story in the history of science, the Huxley story in the history of ideas of evolution, although of course I draw from it. In a way, I'm taking my cue rather more from the history of civilization brief than the history of science that the Huxleys would elicit. It occurs to me, though, that the Huxleys themselves would have puzzled over a distinction between the history of civilization and the history of science. They would have seen these things as quite conflated. And I'm going to begin, as we know, with the Huxleys and cosmology, because that suitably crosses sciences and belief. Now, one of my propositions is that we might learn most from these extraordinary men, the Huxleys, if we consider them as a family or maybe even a dynasty of modern cosmologists. But what did they mean by cosmos? As we know, cosmology is a scientific understanding of the universe, built on a long tradition of thought, on the physical existence of everything that was, everything that always will be, in matter, energy, space, or time. And over the Huxleys' modern era, a great deal changed about this, of course. A shift from at the very least, a shift from perceptions of a static or a closed universe to an open and permanently changing one. But neither of these Huxleys actually was a physicist or a physical scientist at all, and that is the discipline that cosmology as a science belongs to. And so it may seem unlikely or unprofitable to cast them as cosmologists. But cosmology as a physical science grew out of cosmology as a philosophical and religious worldview. Cosmology, cosmography, cosmogony, knowledge on how the universe came to be and came to change, belonged and still belongs as much to belief systems, philosophies, discrete theologies, as to physical earth and life sciences. And there's no question about it, both T.H. and Julian were learned in, if not believers of, and they weren't, multiple religious cosmologies. They were philosophers of life as well as philosophical historians of a sort of the idea of life and universal beginnings. It's unsurprising that T.H. Huxley's famous book, Evidence as to Man's Place in Nature, was reviewed extensively as Man's Place in the Cosmos. Equally unsurprising that Julian Huxley wrote Man's Place in the Universe 70 years later, 1933. Assessing the Huxleys as cosmologists lifts them, I think, from treatment in a very extensive and learned historiography of natural history. Clearly they belong there, but perhaps they've been slightly strictured within it. In other words, it's precisely the reach of cosmology across sciences and across other universal beliefs that captures the Huxleys' own extraordinary and extremely expansive thought. Well, if cosmogony and cosmography were long-standing studies of the planetary system and beyond, the Huxleys dealt mainly but not solely with the planet, our planet, as a whole and its place in universal space. And even though it was Julian and his very famous brother Aldous Huxley, and I'm sure you've been waiting for me to raise him, it was that generation that lived through, that amazing early 20th century period of interplanetary science fiction. They belonged to that generation. And in fact, both of them lived into the actual space age. So even though they belonged to that generation and that milieu, their grandfather already routinely imagined the whole Earth and all of humanity from the vantage point of other planets. So T.H. Huxley, predating all that, could already imagine the Earth from outside. He said at one point, T.H. Huxley, in the early 1860s, "Let us imagine ourselves scientific Saturnanians," he said. And this strange word Saturnanian that at some point turned into Martian, and my understanding that was an 1880s shift and then got popularised by H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds. But before we had Martians, there were Saturnanians, care of T.H. Huxley. And T.H.'s message was that it would be plain and obvious to a Saturnanian that the closest species to the human is the ape. T.H. could and did imagine Earth as a whole, as a planet in space. But the Huxleys were not simply imaginative cosmologists in the tradition of Verne or later Wells. And incidentally, H.G. Wells was a student of T.H. Huxley's. The Huxleys were scientific cosmologists considering the universe not from more typical physical or astronomical sciences, but from evolutionary theory. For both of them, grandfather and grandson, evolution by natural selection was cosmological because it linked all matter in all time. Even non-organic matter was connected to organic matter. Julian Huxley said, "Evolution from cosmic stardust to human society is a comprehensive and continuous process." Elsewhere he said, "All humans were part of a cosmic nature." But in a way, what is more interesting is that his grandfather had said more or less the same thing in 1893. Not merely the world of plants, but that of animals, not merely living things, but the whole fabric of the earth, not merely our planet, but the whole solar system, not merely our star and its satellites, but the millions of similar bodies which bear witness to the order which pervades boundless space and has endured through boundless times, are all working out their predestined courses of evolution. Well, T.H. Huxley was not just a philosopher of life late in his own life, and this is just a couple of years before he died. In fact, from his early years, he was also this kind of seeking this kind of philosophy of unity. Conventionally, his biographers, and there have been many, not a few of them, of T.H. Huxley, extraordinarily good work. It is conventional, though, in biographies of T.H. Huxley to see him coming quite late in life to humanities, to philosophy. But in fact, the more I read his papers, the more I see that even as a young man, he's thinking over and actually deeply troubled by how to think through connections and unity. From the 1840s, this is a very strange, you don't need to read or necessarily understand this diagram. This is an indicator of T.H. Huxley's young 20s mind. He's trying to systematize all knowledge. Already he's, almost a quintessential mid-Victorian. He worked repeatedly over this diagram in his papers in Imperial College London. There's version after version of it. He's trying to capture ways of knowing all matter. A version of this subjective-objective chart of all knowledge about everything appears first in a notebook from 1840. Multiple telling axes. One axis we have here is about the form of knowledge, mediate knowledge at the top there, immediate knowledge. A second axis is about the object of inquiry, what he calls somewhere hypothetical substance of nature/matter. A third was about the knower. On the bottom here, in a way, this is almost the most interesting thing about this diagram. Your left, not self, move along the axis to the self. In other versions of this, he uses the term ego in 1840s. We'll look again at this strange map of what he called hypothetical substance of mind, including mental world, brackets, states of consciousness. We'll look at that in the fourth lecture on minds. But suffice to say for the moment that T.H. Huxley's early and enduring inclination was not just to know everything, but to map how humans might know everything, from cosmology to consciousness itself. Well, over time, T.H.'s cosmology became quite cosmopolitan, especially as he prepared his then quite famous lectures on evolution and ethics. He researched other ways of knowing very closely. He suggested that theories of the universe in which the conception of evolution plays a leading part were evident across the world, from early Indian to early Aegean philosophers, from Stoicism to Buddhism to Hinduism. For many Indian philosophers, for example, he said karma passed from life to life and linked them in the chain of transmigrations. The substance of the cosmos was Brahma, he said at one point. Well, thinking about evolution in cosmological terms and cosmology in evolutionary terms clearly enabled these Huxleys, both of them, neither of them was modest, to upscale the significance of their own thought to the most awesome scale imaginable. They were not immodest, and so they would also often say that their thought would go even beyond what was imaginable. They were theorists of parts within wholes, very much so. They were theorists of systems that in Julian Huxley's era turned into ecology, a new system of thinking parts and wholes together. T.H. wrote well before the idea of the method of ecology was even invented. Th said, what is true of each part is true of the whole. Through all varieties of matter, through infinite diversities of life and thought, possibly through modes of being, of which we neither have a conception nor are competent to form any. Yet if Th verbalized and conceptualized and began to popularize the idea of connection in this way between species and between kinds of matter, it was Julian Huxley's tendency to politicize all of this. Julian Huxley did a great deal to connect internationalism, the idea of world government, and an evolutionist ecology that connected parts to wholes. And he was part of a mid-20th century generation that did this very powerfully. Between the atomic bomb and the population bomb, he would say humanity is poised to obliterate itself. And he would say often that this threatened to extinguish all the evolutionary work that had produced humankind, the Trustees of evolution, over thousands of previous generations. And his response, very classically for the mid-20th century, was a political one. He said, the threat of the atomic bomb is simple: unite or perish. But for Julian, even the realization of world government was comprehended within evolutionary cosmology. He said, once this step, this political step of a new world government was taken, the cosmos will have passed another critical point. So the cosmos and the universe and the world, all these were Huxley's conceptual geography. And they were affected by, over the modern period, by what I think of as a simultaneous expansion and contraction of space and time. So on the one hand, if we think about the trajectory over the 19th and 20th century, on the one hand, the universe itself, conceptions of the universe itself, grew expansively. You know, the idea of the universe went from being closed to being endlessly open. On the other, the planet itself got smaller because more connected. And their comparative ideas were differentiated by a further, what I think of as a pull between these openings and closings. For T.H. Huxley in the 19th century, the universe was a closed system, but the planet, Earth, was largely an open one. It was understood to be expansive, continents there for the taking. It can contain many more, endlessly more people. For Julian, by contrast, the universe had been reconceptualized as open by all of his physicist colleagues, ever expanding, but the planet was definitely closed and limited. And that's why he was so interested in population questions. But what is continuous between the two of them was the question of temporal change. For both of them, time itself got longer and longer, the past got deeper and deeper. At the beginning of T.H. Huxley's life, time was influentially stretched. The biblical 6,000 years was well on its way to being untenable. By the end of his life, it was untenable. People were talking about 3 to 4 billions of years, and T.H. Huxley himself said that that's too short. The great 19th century debate about the age of the Earth was connected to its subset, the antiquity of man. And all kinds of different ideas about time were up for grabs at this point. I'm really interested about how the question of how Julian and T.H. both thought about time, but also the matter with which they did their work. To be blunt, it's clear that, to me, that T.H., in terms of time, was interested in the past, and he told time as a scientist with matter that was dead. Julian Huxley looked to the future, and he was much more interested in matter as a zoologist that was alive. So let me just press on with that in a brief way. Comparative anatomist T.H. Huxley handled and studied and measured and compared bones on the one hand, fossils on the other. He did a bit of work in the field on his rattlesnake journeys, but apart from that, really the most animate things around him were probably the entomology collection building up in Kensington and the vertebrates there that were kind of trophies suspended in taxidermied life. For decades, T.H. Huxley sustained conventional teaching methods of classification and identification of species. He and his students that he taught constantly handled bones, and that is what he examined them on. So one examination question, a very typical one, goes like this. The skull of a crocodile is before you. Enumerate in their proper order the bones of which it is composed and state in what respect it differs from that of a mammal. So that's a very classic kind of teaching that T.H. Huxley was involved in. If our enduring image of Charles Darwin is observer of worms and weeds in his famous Entangled Bank life, our enduring image of Huxley is of the portraits where he's holding the cranium. This was an intellectual and mile, not just from Darwin's contemporary observations of the living, but from his grandson's ethology, animal behaviour. The materials with which T.H. and Julian Huxley told the history of life on Earth were of very different orders of lifelessness. For T.H., fossils were once living organisms that had been dead for at least 10,000 years. And for T.H., the skeletal remains he secured and studied, the older the better. Julian spent most of his time far closer to the animate. Even when he was experimenting on dead things, they were only just so. So he did a lot of work on embryos, for example. Julian was schooled in what were called recapitulation theories that had been dominant in his grandfather's years. So the idea that an embryo of any species mapped and mimicked or followed and displayed the development or the evolution of that species. But as a young researcher, Julian engaged in embryology with what I like to think of as an early 20th century twist. He experimented on hormonal control of metamorphosis and changing tissues. At one point, for example, he fed larval axolotls the thyroid gland of an ox. And he claimed, and he was extremely excited, he said that he had recreated an animal that had not existed, except in tadpole form, he said, for many thousands of years. And so his grandfather, by habit looking backwards in time, would have sought to find and identify and date the fossil of that organism. Julian Huxley in the 1920s looked forward in time as a kind of a futurist to the creation of a new species by his own hands. The great extension of deep time that had awed his grandfather, for Julian Huxley became sometimes quite narrow physiological time. He was interested in what I think of as physiological time, the time that the hours and the months and the years that tissue changes, that humans age, that he did a lot of work on flatworms, as it turns out, how they age and how the aging of that organism might even be suspended or reversed. In a typescript he wrote called Man's Place in the Universe, he explained that the common sense view of a life cycle, cell beginnings, their growth, their differentiation, followed by growth without differentiation, and finally death, he said that might all be rethought. He was intrigued by the prospects of prolonging the life of any organism by grafting, for example. And the cells of tissue that he experimented on, he said, sometimes showed no sign of aging. He said, it would seem that sometimes tissues cultivated, he said, outside the body are probably immortal. Towards the end of his life, Julian Huxley was still engaging with ideas about humans and nature, time and the future. Characteristically, he switched between immediate physiological time and vast evolutionary time, and between individual and cosmic scales. The future of man, comprehended on a vast temporal scale, was a keynote that he delivered in 1963. He said the evolution of this planet as a unit in the cosmic process has been going on for perhaps 5,000 million years, he opened. And then he followed with his most common late-in-life statement about human cosmic uniqueness. Part of the process of evolution of life on Earth, evolved consciousness in humans, means that humans are responsible for future evolution on the planet. And he added, astronomers set that at another 2,750 million years. So in this kind of statement, Julian Huxley was spruiking a particular philosophy of the future that he had come to call evolutionary humanism. Humankind was in a special place at a special moment in time, one that just happened to coincide with his own. The mechanism of evolution had itself been brought into conscious thought. He said, we are now on the threshold of a truly critical step into the phase of self-conscious evolution. For Julian Huxley, humans were absolutely unique. They stood alone, trustees of evolution, since they alone, we alone, would comprehend it, Julian Huxley would always say. And one of his all of his books are very, very well-selling books. One of his bestsellers was a book called The Uniqueness of Man. On this earth, the single and comprehensive process of evolution had unfolded over three sectors, he would say. And he built up a kind of what I think of as a temporal or temporalized stratigraphy. So his grandfather was of a generation when layers of earth were also telling layers of time. So time was stretched because of the fossils that could be found within layers of earth. And when Julian Huxley took that idea, he became very creative with it in a different moment. And he built a philosophy of the present and the future by using these ideas of layers. The first layer, or time, he called the inorganic or cosmic sector, the evolution in time of elements, of stars, of planetary systems. The second layer, or time, he called the organic or the biological sector, the evolution of plant and animal organisms. And the third layer of time was the human sector, the human layer, in which human minds superimposed, he said, pressures on nature and thus on natural selection itself. For biologist Julian Huxley, the two key turning points in this massive history of life on Earth were first the evolution of DNA and genes, he said. Through that, material becomes self-varying and self-reproducing. And second, the evolution of conceptual thought and language, and thus the capacity for humans to transmit experience between generations. He said that's what always made the difference. And that accumulated experience affects future evolution. So this is his idea of evolutionary humanism, for better or worse. And I'm really interested that Julian Huxley conceptualized this accumulated comprehension in this geological manner, this stratigraphic manner. His division of the cosmological past and present into three periods was temporal and layered: geo, bio, homo. Geosphere, biosphere, and he borrowed the idea, a new term, noosphere, which he thought of, and others in his generation, of a human mind layer over the earth. For him, this additional layer was not entirely metaphorical. He said humankind had spread not just its kind, but its knowledge throughout the earth. And humankind, he said, had also spread its materials of surplus existence across the surface of the whole globe. So this new term, the noosphere, was therefore not unlike the additional layer of human manufactured waste matter that now surrounds the Earth and part of the justification for the geological idea of the Anthropocene. Yet in many ways, the current engagement with that idea, the Anthropocene, has almost completely lost the element that Julian Huxley and his grandfather always insisted was central: evolutionary transformation as the great explanator of change. All reality, that's what they wouldn't understand actually about the current discussion. Julian Huxley said all reality, in fact, is evolution. He even extended evolution to the inorganic, to a pre-bio period, aware that this claim was objectionable to some who sought to keep evolution strictly within a biological sense. Julian meant that all universal processes, everything in geo and bio and homo phases, were temporally bound. He said everything proceeded, quote, in a one-way process in time, unitary, continuous, irreversible, self-transforming, and generating variety and novelty during its transformations. And especially for us as historians, Julian Huxley said, this made everything historical. The universe is a process in time. Yet what made his grandfather's and his own time unique was the full comprehension of that statement, he would say, by virtue of evolutionary theory. He said we can now see ourselves as history, and we can see that history in its proper relation with the history of the universe as a whole. He wrote from really a catastrophic era. We might think our own is, but in truth his was. He wrote from a catastrophic era, declaring man's destiny is to be the sole agent for the future evolution of the planet. His grandfather had sought to compile evidence as to man's place in nature. For the grandson, man was so far in nature as to be in charge of it. So in my lecture tomorrow evening, I want to scale down from these cosmological ideas that the Huxleys generated and look at something far more local, but the matter from which they built their ideas. I've called the lecture Species, but really what I'm going to focus on is the central place of animals in the Huxleys' thought. Creatures domestic, creatures zoological, creatures stuffed and fossilized, creatures wild. This was what Julian called the uniqueness of man, made these trustees of evolution the self-appointed trustees of the non-human world as well. Thank you very much indeed.